The Galactic Senate Chamber stood as a towering monument to interstellar diplomacy, a place where empires, federations, and independent colonies gathered under one grand banner of negotiation. Its domed ceiling shimmered with holographic constellations, shifting and pulsing with the movements of distant celestial bodies. Rows of delegates filled the amphitheater, their murmurs blending into an uneasy hum. At the heart of it all, on an elevated platform, stood Michael Stroud, humanity's chosen voice in the assembly. Stroud surveyed the chamber, his sharp blue eyes scanning the multitude of alien faces, their expressions ranging from indifference to barely concealed disdain. The weight of his responsibility pressed against his shoulders, but he remained steady. This moment had been decades in the making, an opportunity for humanity to cement its place among the stars. He adjusted the golden trim of his diplomatic robe, a deliberate gesture to mask the frustration roiling beneath his composed exterior. From across the chamber, Emperor Rhinorian's piercing gaze locked onto him. The ruler of the Galactic Empire exuded authority, his presence an iron weight over the proceedings. Tall and imposing, with dark silver skin and elongated features, Rhinorian had ruled with calculated ruthlessness. His robe, woven from the silk of creatures harvested in the depths of imperial space, draped over him like shadow incarnate. His people, dominant for centuries, viewed humanity as little more than an ambitious anomaly. Stroud stepped forward. The Terran Accord offers a path to mutual prosperity. We have fought wars, yes. We have been adversaries. But the tide of history turns to those who embrace change. This galaxy need not remain shackled to old enmities. A silence stretched over the room, thick and suffocating. Rhinorian remained motionless, his gaze unblinking. Then, slowly, a smirk curled his lips. "And what?" The Emperor's voice rang through the hall, smooth yet laced with condescension. "Makes you believe humanity deserves a seat among the great powers?" Stroud met his stare, his voice unwavering. "We have earned it." The Emperor's laughter echoed, a sound that sent a ripple of unease through the assembly. "Earned? You have merely survived." His hand lifted, gesturing toward the guards stationed along the chamber's perimeter. "There is an error in assumption, Ambassador Stroud. This was never a negotiation." The moment fractured. From the shadows, a blur of motion, a figure, cloaked in imperial black, emerged with lethal precision, an energy blade crackling to life in a flicker of violet light. Stroud barely registered the attack before the blade plunged into his chest, searing through flesh and bone. A gasp, choked and wet, escaped his lips as agony consumed him. Gasps erupted from the assembly. Some delegates recoiled. Others leaned forward in horrified fascination. The assassin withdrew the blade with a fluid motion, allowing Stroud's body to collapse onto the pristine marble floor. A pool of crimson spread beneath him, stark against the pale stone. His fingers twitched, reaching, grasping for something unseen. The last breath left him in a shuddering exhale. The chamber exploded into chaos. The Terran delegation surged to their feet, shouts of outrage mingling with the scrambled movements of security forces. Across the room, Captain Lance Vance, stationed as a discreet military observer, lunged forward, his instinct screaming for action. His hand hovered over his sidearm, but he knew the futility of drawing a weapon in the Emperor's presence. His heart pounded as he locked eyes with Rhinorian, who regarded the scene with cold amusement. The Emperor raised a hand, and the room stilled, the unspoken threat of his authority suffocating any further movement. "Let this be the lesson humanity must learn," he declared, his voice cutting through the charged silence. "You do not dictate terms. You submit, or you perish." Vance clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. Every fiber of his being screamed for retribution, but acting here would be suicide. He turned on his heel, his movements rigid with fury, and stormed toward the exit. The moment he reached the corridor outside, He activated his communicator. "This is Captain Vance," he spoke, his voice low and controlled, but seething with rage. "Secure a channel to United Terran Command. Now." On Earth, the message arrived within moments, piercing the war room like a dagger to the heart. The chamber, lined with high-ranking officials and military leaders, fell into stunned silence as the transmission played. President Aaron Warren sat at the head of the table, his jaw tightening as the reality of the situation sank in. Around him, the gathered admirals and generals exchanged grim glances. This was not merely an attack. This was a declaration. Warren exhaled slowly. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of inevitability. "They believe we will cower. They believe we will bend." His gaze swept the room, finding each of them in turn. They could not be more mistaken. Admiral Tobias John leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "Immediate deployment?" Warren nodded. "Every available fleet, every division, every asset." His hands curled into fists atop the polished surface of the table. "The Empire has sealed its fate." In the depths of space, the engines of Terran warships roared to life. The banners of peace fell, replaced by the insignia of war. Humanity had been struck. Now it would strike back. The weight of war settled over the United Terran Command like a storm cloud, thick with the gravity of impending action. In the war room deep beneath Geneva's fortified underground complex, Admiral Tobias John stood before a vast display of the galactic map, its luminous projections casting harsh angles over his battle-worn face. Lines of red marked the Empire's controlled sectors, their dominion stretching like a malignancy through the stars. Silence clung to the room, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of John's fingers against the table's steel surface. Across from him, President Aaron Warren observed the same map, his expression carved from stone. The assassination of Ambassador Stroud had not merely been a provocation. It had been a declaration of contempt, a message that humanity's voice in galactic affairs was nothing more than an inconvenience to be silenced. They had made a mistake. Admiral John's voice carried no hesitation. "Fleet mobilization is underway. 3 full battle groups positioned along the Perseus border. 2 reinforcing Alpha Centauri. Our strike force is prepped." His gaze shifted to Major Samuel Pierce, whose presence alone exuded a controlled lethality. "Your unit is greenlit for infiltration. No delays." Pierce gave a curt nod, adjusting the straps of his combat harness. "Intel suggests key logistical nodes in the Tyrex system. Disrupting their supply lines will cripple fleet movement. We hit them fast, take out their command centers, and disappear before they know what happened." Warren folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "Civilian casualties?" Pierce's tone remained even. "Minimal. Precision targeting. If we play this right, they won't have time to react." From the far end of the table, Dr. Aiden Cross adjusted his glasses, his mind already cycling through the myriad calculations necessary for humanity's technological advantage to assert itself. The Empire relied on sheer numbers, their fleets vast and overwhelming. But brute force would not decide this war. Strategy would. Adaptability would. Humanity had long since shed the naivety of assuming brute strength dictated the victor. "Their Achilles heel is predictability," Cross remarked, his voice smooth measured. "They follow established doctrines, rigid and absolute. We strike where they assume we won't, utilize assets they dismiss as inferior. AI combat integration will allow our forces to outmaneuver them before they process the engagement. Projections estimate a 74% higher efficiency rate in conflict scenarios where human adaptability is enhanced with tactical AI coordination." John's approval was immediate. "We integrate on all fleet units. Effective immediately." The hum of acknowledgement from the gathered officers underscored the gravity of the moment. They were no longer discussing possibilities. They were cementing the reality of war. In the cold vacuum of deep space, humanity's fleets roared to life. Hundreds of warships, their dark hulls reflecting the distant glow of stars, slipped from dry docks and surged into formation. They were not the sprawling masses of uncoordinated fighters that the Empire commanded. These were precision instruments of warfare, built not for spectacle, but for decisive action. Railgun batteries, plasma lances, and graviton warheads lined their armaments, each a testament to Earth's relentless pursuit of technological supremacy. At the helm of the UTS Hawkeye, Admiral John observed the final preparations, his seasoned hands gripping the command railing as reports streamed in. The fleet had been divided into 3 primary strike groups, each designed to exploit a different vulnerability in the Empire's defenses. The first would engage the Empire's forward patrols, drawing their forces into pre-calculated kill zones. The second, led by John himself, would execute a direct assault on the Empire's nearest stronghold, severing their ability to respond. The third, a covert operations unit under Major Pierce, would dismantle infrastructure and sow chaos from within. A countdown initiated on the bridge. The fleet was ready. On the distant world of Zareth 5, a minor yet strategically vital planet within the Empire's network, the first shots of war rang through the night sky. Fire and metal clashed as the Terran strike teams descended, their drop pods piercing the atmosphere with calculated precision. The Empire's defenses had anticipated a direct assault, but they had not anticipated speed, nor the ruthless efficiency with which the human forces executed their mission. Pierce moved like a shadow through the urban expanse of the capital city's outer district, his squad in tight formation behind him. The target, a central data hub, a nerve center responsible for relaying military directives across the system. Disabling it would not only blind local Imperial forces, but sever coordination between entire sectors. Gunfire erupted as they breached the perimeter, the Empire's soldiers scrambling to respond. Their armor was formidable, their training rigorous, but they fought in patterns predictable and rigid. Pierce's team exploited every hesitation a death sentence for their enemies. Suppressed rounds cut through the air, followed by the distant echoes of detonations as explosives found their marks. Pierce pressed forward, his combat knife finding the gap between an Imperial officer's plated defenses. The blade slid deep, silencing the soldier before he could issue a command. The body crumpled, and Pierce was already moving, clearing the corridor for his tech specialist to access the hub's core systems. 60 seconds, the specialist announced, his hands a blur over the console. The seconds stretched long, each moment punctuated by the sounds of battle outside. Then a flicker, system shutdown. The entire facility plunged into darkness. Across the region, Empire forces faltered as their communications blacked out. The advantage was secured. Pierce keyed his communicator. Objective complete. From orbit, the confirmation was met with swift retaliation. The Hawkeye's railguns thundered, tearing through the disoriented Imperial fleet. Without coordination, their formations broke, ships drifting into disarray as human warships carved through them with ruthless efficiency. On the bridge, John watched the tactical display as the enemy's defensive lines collapsed. Signal the President. Warren's face appeared on screen, the glow of the holographic feed illuminating his Hawkeye expression. The first engagement is ours, John reported. Their network is in disarray. Now we push. Warren gave a slow nod, his voice devoid of hesitation. No peace talks. No negotiations. They set these terms. We finish it. The war had begun, and humanity would not stop until the Empire was nothing but dust in the void. The void of space had never been a place of silence. It roared with the echoes of war, the shriek of dying vessels, and the unrelenting hum of destruction. The Galactic Empire, once a monolith of power, now found itself fractured, its defenses crumbling under an assault it had never anticipated. What had begun as a dismissal of humanity had turned into their greatest miscalculation. The battlefield stretched across the stars, and the Terran forces pressed forward, relentless, adaptive, and efficient. Admiral Tobias John stood at the helm of the Hawkeye, his gaze locked onto the tactical display as enemy formations shifted in desperation. The Empire's fleets, once symbols of unmatched dominance, moved with growing uncertainty. Their battle doctrines, designed for conflicts of attrition, failed against the speed and precision of Terran warships. The Hawkeye led the assault, its railguns launching kinetic rounds at near-light speed, tearing through Imperial hulls before their shields could compensate. A warning flashed across the command console. Imperial reinforcements had emerged from slipspace, their numbers swelling in a last-ditch effort to reclaim the sector. John barely acknowledged the threat, his mind already calculating probabilities. Numbers meant nothing without tactics, and the Empire was learning that too late. "Adjust formation," he ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding beyond the viewport. "Give them a corridor to advance. Then collapse it." The fleet obeyed with practiced precision. The Terran warship split, allowing the Imperial reinforcements to surge forward, believing for an instant that they had forced an opening. Then the trap snapped shut. Human vessels curved inward, cutting off their retreat. Plasma lances and railgun rounds converged in a merciless crossfire. The space between them became a graveyard of twisted metal and detonating reactors. Below, on the surface of Zareth 5, Major Samuel Pierce and his strike teams moved like wraiths through the ruins of a shattered Imperial command post. Fires raged through the wreckage of once proud fortifications. The bodies of Imperial soldiers, their gleaming armor now scorched and broken, littered the ground. Pierce's exosuit pulsed with the faint glow of integrated combat enhancements, his every movement calculated, efficient, lethal. He pressed against the cover of a fallen transport, motioning for his team to advance. Their objective lay within the heart of the capital city, a strategic node that controlled planetary defenses across the sector. Without it, the Empire would lose its last foothold in this region of space. An explosion rocked the Earth as an Imperial gunship made a desperate strafing run, its cannons churning the ground into molten slag. Pierce barely had time to move before debris rained down around him. His visor recalibrated, filtering out the smoke and flames. He spotted the gunship banking for another pass. A targeting reticle flickered across his display. His hands moved before thought could catch up. The shoulder-mounted missile system locked on and he fired. The projectile streaked upward, its propulsion silent against the din of battle. The impact came a heartbeat later. The gunship twisted mid-air, engine sputtering, then erupted into a fireball, fragments cascading toward the war-torn city below. "Move," Pierce barked, surging forward. Inside the control hub, the remaining Imperial forces had fortified their position. Their desperation was evident. Barricades hastily erected, officers barking orders in strained voices. They had never expected to be on the defensive, never believed that humanity would bring the war to them. Pierce's team breached the entrance with a synchronized detonation. The blast tore through the barricade, sending a shockwave through the chamber beyond. The Imperials barely had time to react before the Terran forces stormed inside. The skirmish was brutal but short. The Empire's soldiers fought with discipline, but it was discipline rooted in outdated tactics. They anticipated prolonged engagements, drawn-out exchanges of fire. Humanity did not fight wars of attrition. They fought to end them. A single Imperial officer remained, wounded, his breath ragged. Pierce stood over him, weapon trained, but the fight had already left the man's eyes. "This is impossible," the officer whispered. "You shouldn't have won. You." His words failed him, disbelief more potent than the pain of his wounds. Pierce didn't answer. The war didn't need explanations. A transmission cut through the comms, Admiral John's voice steady but edged with finality. "The sector is secured. Prepare for the next phase." Across the galaxy, The ripple of war spread. The empire, once a behemoth of unchallenged rule, found itself faltering. Humanity had shattered their illusions of superiority. Every engagement reinforced a brutal truth. Strategy and innovation triumphed over stagnation. Imperial commanders, bred for war under the assumption of their own invincibility, now found themselves scrambling for countermeasures that did not exist. At the heart of the empire, within the grand halls of the imperial palace, Emperor Rhinorian listened in silence as reports poured in. His advisors spoke in panicked tones, their carefully cultivated arrogance now replaced with growing dread. He had dismissed humanity as a nuisance, an upstart species unworthy of consideration. Now they stood at the gates of his dominion, their vengeance unfolding with ruthless precision. General Kalos, his most trusted strategist, stood rigid before him, his expression unreadable. "Your orders, Majesty?" The Emperor exhaled slowly, the weight of reality pressing down upon him. "We make them bleed, no matter the cost." Kalos hesitated, then nodded. He knew what this meant. The war would no longer be one of conquest, but of desperation. Humanity had proven itself more than capable of matching the Empire in battle. Now, the Empire would abandon restraint. No laws of engagement, no semblance of civility. If they could not win through conventional means, they would resort to annihilation. A single command echoed through the Empire's vast network. A final act of defiance. Deploy the bioweapons. Across the Terran front, the war raged on, but a darker shadow now loomed. The enemy had recognized its own mortality and, in its fear, had chosen destruction over surrender. Admiral John, standing aboard the Hawkeye, watched the incoming reports with a grim expression. The Empire had reached the precipice of desperation, and desperate foes were the most dangerous. He turned to his officers, his voice as steady as ever. "Inform the President. The Empire has made its choice. Now we make ours." The battle for the galaxy was far from over. Humanity had proven its strength, but now it would face the Empire's final, most insidious weapon. And they would be ready. The darkness of space bore witness to the final act of a war that had reshaped the galaxy. The Terran fleets advanced with ruthless precision, their warships cutting through the remnants of the Empire's once mighty armada. The battle had stretched across star systems, but now at the threshold of the Imperial homeworld, the last confrontation loomed. Admiral Tobias John stood at the command station of the Hawkeye, his gaze steady as the tactical display projected the Imperial capital world before him. Varkos Prime, jewel of the Empire, now a fortress of desperation. The planetary defense grid pulsed, with overlapping layers of energy shielding, an impenetrable cocoon of firepower that had protected it for centuries. The Empire's final stronghold. "The Empire's thrown everything they have into defending the capital," Commander Hart reported, his voice laced with quiet urgency. "Their fleets are down to 30% of their original numbers, but they've consolidated in a defensive ring. No gaps, no weaknesses." John studied the projection, his mind parsing through strategies. A direct assault would be suicide. The planetary defenses alone could tear through an entire battle group. But brute force was never humanity's way. Every Imperial strategy followed a pattern, a reliance on strength that had long been their downfall. "We break their formation from the inside," John said, turning to his officers. "Major Pierce's unit will infiltrate the planetary shield generator. Once it's down, we strike with everything we have." Across the comms, Major Samuel Pierce's voice crackled to life. "We're already on approach. We'll handle it." Far below the orbital battlefield, Pierce and his strike team descended through the choking atmosphere of Varkos Prime. The cityscape stretched beneath them, a sprawling labyrinth of towering spires and industrial sectors. Smoke rose in thick plumes where Terran orbital strikes had disabled key structures. The Empire's soldiers patrolled the streets, their movements frantic, desperate. They knew the end was coming. The transport pod shuddered as it neared the drop zone. Pierce adjusted the straps of his combat harness, his mind sharp with focus. There was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. The war had led to this moment. As the pod doors hissed open, his team leaped into the chaos. The Imperial streets erupted in gunfire. Soldiers in gleaming armor took positions along fortified barricades, their plasma weapons cutting through the night. Pierce moved fast, ducking between cover as his squad engaged. They had landed in the heart of the industrial sector, not far from their objective, an underground control hub that housed the planetary shield's power source. Explosions rocked the streets as Terran fire teams swept through, pushing back the entrenched defenders. Pierce sprinted through a side passage, flanking a cluster of Imperial troops before cutting them down in a burst of rifle fire. His movements were automatic, instincts sharpened by years of warfare. "Entrance is ahead," his lieutenant shouted over the comms. The shield facility loomed before them, its reinforced gates glowing with security locks. Imperial elites guarded the entry, their heavy armor gleaming beneath the artificial lights. Pierce gritted his teeth. There was no time for a prolonged fight. He motioned to his demolitions expert. "Breaching charge." Now, the explosive was set within seconds. The blast tore through the reinforced gate, sending a shockwave that staggered the defenders. Before they could recover, Pierce's team surged forward, weapons blazing. The corridor filled with screams and gunfire as the Imperials fell, their last stand collapsing under the unrelenting assault. Pierce reached the control room, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The massive power relays pulsed with energy, feeding directly into the planetary shield. His tech specialist hacked into the system, fingers flying over the console. 30 seconds, the specialist muttered. A security alarm blared. More Imperials were coming. Pierce turned, readying his weapon as reinforcements stormed the chamber. His squad took defensive positions, holding the line as the final countdown ticked away. Then the power grid flickered. The shield over Varkos Prime wavered, and then it collapsed. In orbit, Admiral John watched as the impenetrable barrier shattered. His lips pressed into a thin line. All ships, fire at will. The sky ignited. Terran warships unleashed everything they had. Railgun salvos tore through enemy strongholds. Plasma lances melted through command centers. Missile barges reduced fortified structures to rubble. The Imperial fleet, already weakened, crumbled under the relentless assault. The Hawkeye led the charge, its forward cannons targeting the Imperial palace itself. The once glistening heart of the Empire trembled under the bombardment, its spires crumbling in waves of fire and destruction. On the ground, chaos reigned. With the shield down, Terran forces poured into the city, engaging in brutal street-to-street combat. The Empire's last defenders fought with the desperation of those who had never imagined defeat. But there was no stopping what had already begun. Within the collapsing palace, Emperor Rhinorian stood before a shattered viewport, his hands gripping the railing as he watched his world burn. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone. Only disbelief remained. The doors behind him burst open. Major Pierce stepped inside, his rifle trained, his expression unreadable. His armor was scorched, his body bruised, but his gaze never wavered. Rhinorian turned slowly, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. "Do you even understand what you've done?" His voice was raw, the last vestiges of his empire slipping from his grasp. "You've doomed this galaxy." Pierce didn't answer. Words were meaningless now. He pulled the trigger. The Emperor's body crumpled to the floor. Outside, the last of the Imperial forces surrendered. Across the galaxy, the remnants of their rule shattered like broken glass. The war was over. On the Hawkeye, Admiral John received the final confirmation. His hands, which had guided humanity through the greatest war in its history, finally relaxed at his sides. The silence that followed was deafening. Back on Earth, President Warren stood before billions of Terran citizens, his expression one of quiet resolve. Today we stand victorious, not as conquerors, but as survivors. The Empire believed they could decide our fate. They were wrong. The war had ended. Humanity had risen. And the stars belonged to them now.